As society becomes more and more progressive, or maybe you could say more and more pagan, are Christian moral principles still meaningful? I mean, if society has tossed away belief in the Bible, the revelation of Scripture, can they likewise toss out Christian morality with it? Does Christian morality rise or fall solely on the basis of Scripture, or can it stand on logic and reason? We'll discuss that next, but first, as always, we start with our mission. Today we're discussing Christian morality. What is the basis for the Christian moral code? And how can we even begin to know what is right and what is wrong if we learn this faith, if we live this faith, if we share this faith? What will the next 100 years look like? Join the mission. Lately, we've seen a dramatic shift in social norms. What used to be considered very taboo has all of a sudden become very commonplace. And oftentimes, this liberalization follows directly from a rejection of Christian biblical principles, and in many cases, from a complete misunderstanding of Christian biblical principles. You may have seen a few weeks ago, Joe Scarborough was actually arguing for abortion based on the fact that Jesus never mentions abortion in the gospel.
Just say, as a Southern Baptist that grew up reading the Bible, maybe a backslidden Baptist, but I still know the Bible, Jesus never once talked about abortion. Never once. And it was happening back in ancient times. It was happening during his time. Never once mentioned it. And for people perverting the gospel of Jesus Christ down to one issue, it's heresy.
So it's important that we not only understand what it is that we believe, but we know why it is that we believe it to begin with. So in this series, I seek to show that Christian morality is not based entirely on divine revelation, but also on logic and reason. And to do so, we're going to refer to this book. It's called Christian Social Principles. It was written by Sister Mary O'Brien, O.P. This book is a reissue or reprint by Sophia Press. It was originally published in 1941, and Sophia's brought it back for us so that we can have it today. Sister Mary O'Brien was responding to the Pope's calls back in that time. You may recall, starting with Pope Leo XIII and moving through the next century, many of those popes were calling for a renewal in Thomistic thought. They were identifying this abandonment of Thomism as the root cause for so many of society's social ills. As a matter of fact, in the introduction to the book, which was written by Archbishop FULTON SHEEN, he says, the sickness of this world is due less to new ideas than to the rejection of old truths. And listen to this is quite prophetic. He says, and among these old truths, none has had more disastrous consequences than the abandonment of the true nature of man. So Archbishop FULTON SHEEN being prophetic there again. But this text was written, I think it was intended to be a textbook for social ethics for maybe high school seniors or college freshmen, but it's a great source for all of us. Her work is divided into 4 parts. In this series, we're going to look at the first part, which is 8 chapters. And so we'll do 8 videos, 8 short videos, where we're going to break down some of the concepts and the principles in each chapter so that you will be able to read those chapters and understand the background knowledge and the vocabulary necessary to approach these texts properly. So first, let's look at what she seeks to do in chapter 1. So in chapter 1, Sister wants to look at how it is that we know anything to begin with. What is the source of knowledge in general? Many people may think that Christians only believe things that we find in the Bible. We only believe things that we perceive that God has told us. And then if you don't believe in God or you don't believe in the Bible, then that becomes an excuse to reject everything that Christians teach. But that's kind of a misunderstanding. Christians have 2 sources of knowledge. We have theology or divine revelation, and those are the things that we only know because Jesus told us, or Moses and the prophets told us, or the gospel writers or St. Paul told us in Scripture, or things that were passed down through the tradition of the church. So, for example, we know that Jesus Christ is the Son of God. We know that that God is a Trinity of persons, and we only know these things because Jesus revealed them to the apostles, and the apostles passed them down through the church to us to this day. That's how we know those things. That's called divine revelation. That's called sacred tradition. That's called the deposit of faith. What we're speaking about, what Sister's speaking about in chapter 1, is not appealing to any type of revelation. She's speaking about how we know natural knowledge, things that we can know without God telling us, without the church telling us, things that we can perceive for ourselves. And of natural knowledge, she identifies two types of natural knowledge: first principles and reasoning. I think everybody here has kind of a good understanding of what reasoning is. If I give you the number 2 and I give you the number 3, and I ask you what is the sum of those two numbers, you can kind of do this exercise in your mind, or this working, this struggling in your brain, where you can take those two things and you can put them together, or you can take them apart, or whatever need be, and you can come to a conclusion that the sum of 2 and 3 is 5. Well, that's reasoning, and I think we all have a good grasp of that. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a few slides. It's first principles that I think people often struggle with. What do we mean by first principles? So first principles are those things that are self-evident. They're not things that you can know through demonstration. You don't know them through an experiment. You can't really even prove them. They're just things that we know, so we call them self-evident. Sister gives us 5 or 6 examples, and I'll go over the definitions for these examples here, but there's more than this, but she's just using these to kind of establish the concept in our minds. But essentially, a self-evident first principle is something that somebody, let's say somebody's born alone on a deserted island and they have no teacher, they have no parents. These are things that they should be able to know, they should be able to understand completely of themselves without having somebody teach them, without having to discover it. It's an act of the mind. And so she gives 5 examples here, and as I start to break these down, it'll make more sense. So the first one is the principle of identity, and she says that it is a thing is itself and not something else. So this pencil that I'm holding is this pencil. It's not that apple. It is this, and it is only this. And you can see how basic this concept is. A child should be able to understand and not get confused between the apple and the pencil. They should understand that this is this. This should, they should be able to understand that without, a detailed proof or a detailed explanation. The next principle she gives us is the principle of contradiction. A thing cannot be itself and something else at the same time. So this pencil cannot be that apple at the same time and in the same way. Another way of putting this is if we take the apple, this principle often refers to things like color or size or shape or what we call accidents. So this apple is red. It cannot also be yellow at the same time in the same way. It may be that it's red on one side and yellow on the other side, but that's two parts of it that have two different features or two different accidents. But to say that it's red all over and it's yellow all over, that would be to say that it has two different qualities in the same way at the same time, and that would violate the principle of contradiction. So this is something that we all know just by virtue of being human. We don't need somebody to explain it to us. Another example she gives is finality, that everything has been made for a purpose, otherwise it would have no reason to exist. So the apple, the purpose for this is to bring into creation another apple tree. So the next one she has is the principle of cause, that every finite thing has a cause for its existence, otherwise it could never be brought into existence. And her last example is the principle of sufficient reason. This is, she says, everything must have an adequate reason for itself, for its existence. And this is, you can see this in children if they're sitting in the back seat or they're in the grocery cart and they're asking questions, Mom, Dad, why is the sky blue? Why is this, that, or they continually ask these whys. Why are they asking that question? They're presuming that there's a reason that the sky is blue or whatever the question is that they're asking. So Sister's going to explain that knowledge at this level is called understanding, or the intellectual habit of understanding. It is the grasping of first principles. So what she's going to do is she's going to present a hierarchy of knowledge, and this is going to be that foundational level, the first level of knowing things. So children should know these things without being taught. And if they do, if children have a good grasp of these first principles, then we say that they have common sense. If they don't readily have a good grasp of first principles, that may be an indication that as they get older, they may have struggles in school learning, because it is these first principles upon which new knowledge is built. And I'm going to demonstrate that here on the next slide. But it is the intellectual habit of understanding, which is this foundational level. Okay, and so on the next slide, we go to the next degree of the hierarchy, which is reasoning. Now, I'm getting ahead of myself here, but I thought this would help to understand reasoning. So I made a syllogism, and this kind of thing is going to be more appropriate as you get deeper into moral theology. But I started here with a first principle. So the first principle I used here from the Ten Commandments, that is, it is wrong to kill an innocent human person. So this is from natural law, this is from the Ten Commandments, but this is something that everybody should know without ever having to be told that it's wrong to kill an innocent human person. So reasoning is going to be that intellectual habit in which you start with the first principle, such as this one, and then you look at the circumstances that you find yourself in, and you apply that first principle to your circumstances to come up with a conclusion. And so you can see how your mind is working here. Compare this to that example I gave earlier of 3 + 2 = 5. So you've got these two pieces of data, the 3 and the 2, and you're combining them, and you're doing this work in your mind to produce a conclusion. That's what's happening here. We've got basically moral reasoning. The principle is that it is wrong to kill an innocent human person. The circumstance that I find myself in is that maybe I'm having an altercation with St. Thomas. But St. Thomas is an innocent person. So despite having this altercation, the conclusion that I must come to is that it is wrong to kill Thomas. So you can see what's happening here is I'm working, my mind is working, and it's knowledge that's being built upon the first principle. So there was a first principle, then there was a circumstance that was put onto it, and that work that my mind did produced new knowledge. We call that reasoning, or the intellectual habit, or the intellectual virtue of knowledge. So on page 9, Sister will say, this is in great part the knowledge which we learn from our teachers and our textbooks. So this knowledge that we have from reasoning is the knowledge that we'll learn from school, we'll learn from our parents, we'll learn from study, we'll learn from doing homework, we'll learn from working things out. It is the knowledge acquired through reasoning and experimentation. And here she's going to particularize it. She's going to show how there's all of these sciences of biology, of chemistry, of mathematics, and that's an important point. I'll explain here in a moment. She says, it includes the knowledge of the laws and facts of the sciences of biology, of chemistry, of mathematics, of economics. So important to kind of understand here is that first level of knowledge, the intellectual habit of understanding, of grasping first principles. At that level, we are working with first principles, and that knowledge is kind of a general knowledge that applies to all of our experiences. As we use those first principles to do work, to reason, to come to this next degree of knowledge, that knowledge starts to become particularized into specific fields, or St. Thomas Aquinas calls them sciences, such as mathematics or biology or chemistry. And then the work that is done in, let's say, in mathematics, the work that's done in mathematics, the knowledge that is formed through that field or that science then becomes particularized even more into further sciences, like a subscience, you might say, of mathematics. So then you might go up a level to geometry, to trigonometry, to calculus, to algebra, to these things that come from mathematics. And the important thing here to understand is that once you get to geometry, all of the principles that were learned in mathematics, that level of knowledge, geometry doesn't seek to reprove those facts. It presumes them. It takes them for granted as if they were first principles themselves. And geometry seeks to work with geometry specifically, but it presumes what it received from mathematics, and mathematics presumes what it receives from first principles. The other example, biology. As biology forms new knowledge, then that new knowledge becomes particularized into maybe medicine or nursing or veterinary, and those fields, they don't seek to prove again what was already proven or known in biology. They presume that knowledge, that biology then becomes the first principle for medicine. Okay, so you see this hierarchies form, and I want to show this on the next slide because I think it starts to become a little bit more clear. She shows here, or she's following St. Thomas, this hierarchy of the intellectual habits. So as we've explained, we've got the intellectual habit of understanding. Then we can build on top of that to the intellectual habit of knowledge. So now we got this third tier in the hierarchy, which is wisdom. So what does she say about wisdom? On the same page, on page 9, she says that a wise man is far more than a chemist, a biologist, a physicist, a mathematician. So those particular fields, she's referencing them. She says that a wise man is more than just one of those. A man possessed of the habit of wisdom, a truly wise man, sees the relationship between the truths of biology and physics and of chemistry and of mathematics and of economics and all of the natural sciences, of all human knowledge. So wisdom is the intellectual habit of seeing how all of the particular aspects of knowledge, or the particular knowledge in each field, relates to each other, and how there's an overall connection. And she goes on here to say, he sees the fundamental cause of these truths. He sees the truths of these limited sciences as being part of the great truth, which is infinite truth, which is God's unlimited and unlimitable wisdom. So again, the person who is wise sees how the truths of all these particular sciences connect to each other, or how they relate to each other, and they can step back and see the whole concept, the whole field of knowledge. Now, she's also going to explain here, I like the way she describes this, that on these grades of the hierarchy, she explains that at this level, you have the thinking person, but who's uneducated or maybe untutored. So at the understanding level, an individual, they're thinking, it's an intellectual habit, of course, so they're thinking, but they've not been taught something in the arts or in the sciences. At the next degree, in the degree of knowledge, we have a person who is educated in the arts and the sciences. And then at the top level, like I said, we have a truly wise person who views all knowledge in its perspective, in its relationship with each other. Now, so these are what we call the intellectual habits, or another word for habits that you may be more familiar with is virtues, and you may be more familiar with, I'm going to show you on the next slide, it's not particularly part of this chapter, but I kind of wanted to tie it in here to help you make a connection here. But you're probably familiar with the moral virtues. prudence, justice, temperance, and fortitude. These virtues relate to the actions, the things that we do, whereas this chapter has been focused on intellectual habits, the 3 intellectual habits of understanding, knowledge, and wisdom. As we move further into moral theology, we'll discuss more specifically the moral habits, because it's going to be very, very important. So this brings us to the end of chapter 1, and we will continue on with chapter 2 in the next video. So thank you very much for watching. With all of our technological advancements, with all of our social advancements, with all of our modern conveniences and modern luxuries, why are we still not happy